Continuing in paragraph 9, it describes the closing costs that a seller would pay. Again, it's a checkbox method, but these are in a logical sequence. So we'll start with 203, the deed stamps. You know, Florida doesn't have a state income tax, so a large part of the state's revenue is from these transfer taxes, the note stamp and intangible tax that we talked about under buyer will pay, and the deed stamps. The Florida deed stamps haven't changed since 1992. They're 70 cents per hundred, or another way to say that is $7 per thousand. So if we had a $100,000 selling price, then the deed stamps would be $700. In line 204, we would normally expect the seller to pay for title insurance for the buyer. That's known as owner's title. Florida fixes that rate by law. So the rate is $5.75 per thousand up to $100,000, plus any amount over $100,000 up to $1 million. Then for that extra amount, it's $5 per thousand. So for example, if we had a $200,000 sale, we would have to add up $575 plus $500 for $1,075. I hope you have to know that above $1 million, it's $2.50 a thousand for that part above $1 million. Understand that if the seller has title insurance less than 3 years old, they will save about 40% on that premium on what's known as a reissue credit. All settlement agents are bound by law to give that reissue credit if the seller produces a title policy less than 3 years old, or if it's vacant land, it can be of any age. Title search is what's necessary for an issuance of the title insurance commitment. The title search costs about $100. I've seen them between $80 and $130. If it's a lot and block description and you estimate $100, you'll be right on. And if it's a meets and bounds and you estimate $125, you'll be close enough. Line 206 would be who pays for the settlement fee, and then in Northeast Florida, as we've said, it's customarily the seller paying that fee. I can't tell you how much other people charge. There is no price fixing. I can tell you that I charge $500 for an average closing. And again, there are probably some that are less and probably some that are more, so you'll need to check that out and estimate that. Survey maps depend on, the price depends on the type of property. If it's a normal subdivision lot with a house, survey maps are about $300. If there's a pool, that might be $350, but it would be more if it's a large parcel of property. Satisfaction of mortgage, yeah, we expect the seller to pay off their mortgage and record a satisfaction for $10, but we found that lately most lenders include the $10 in their payoff figures. 209 would be seller courier fees. If we have to overnight something to the seller, it could be a UPS of seller documents on a mail away, or in a rare case, we have to overnight or courier a seller payoff letter. Mostly we do all that by wire or email. On the right-hand column under the 1-year home warranty 203, many sellers will offer a 1-year home warranty to induce the buyers to buy the house, and it costs about $400 for the basic program. There are several national companies that do it. You've probably heard of Old Republic and First American and American Home Shield and Broward Factory. The next is the real estate brokerage fee. Now we're talking about what the seller would pay. Well, even if you forgot to mark that, the seller is obligated to pay you pursuant to the listing agreement. But you're not going to forget to mark that, I hope, and it would also include if you charge an admin transaction broker-only fee. Title insurance endorsements, we won't mark. It's not normally a seller cost, but occasionally it is. Same with lender flood cert fees, not normally a seller cost. Mortgage discount, again, we're not in the market of high interest rates, so we're not seeing sellers buy down interest rates. And normally the seller doesn't pay for the appraisal, but we do offer that as a flexible option. Under other, sometimes you'll see somebody put something like up to $3,000 of the buyer's closing costs and prepaids, and that generally is okay. Sometimes the lender requires the buyer to put more down, and they might not let the entire $3,000, or if you put a bigger number, might not let the entire $5,000 be paid. But it's not that rare to see a seller offer to pay some of the buyer's closing costs and prepaids. And then in 212, we expect the buyer to pay for the HOA estoppel fee. The root word of estoppel is the word stop. That means that the issuer of the estoppel fee, the HOA or condo association, can't change their mind later and says, oh, we made a mistake. The dues are really more than what we said. And then it says here, payable on request of the closing attorney settlement agent. It may not be too long before you hear settlement agents routinely say, we want the money from the seller now. We don't want to advance the money for the seller. And these estoppel fees range anywhere from $100 to $500. Probably the most common is about $300. In line 214, it says if there are any charges that the lender won't let the buyer pay, the seller's agreed to pay them. And really about the only non-allowable now is for VA. The buyer can't pay the deed stamps, and that's customarily a seller charge anyway. Subparagraph D, beginning with 216, says that if the seller agrees to pay any of the buyer's costs, as for example, up to $3,000 of the closing costs, it's only those things marked. And that's put in there to prevent there being excess money, and the buyer says, oh, well, the cost only came to X, the seller agreed to pay more, I'll just buy down my great rate with some discount points. And so this negates that. If they don't mark discount, then the seller doesn't pay those. In 220, it says, of course, all the mortgage payments have to be current. That goes without saying. Next is more important, talking about special assessments. So years ago, I'm running down Scott Mill Road and I see a lot of pipes and dirt. What was going on there? Well, they were requiring people who were on septic tank to hook up the city sewer, and that can cost several thousands of dollars. So the city is nice, rather than make the seller, the owner, pay all those several thousands, now they'll spread it over 3 or 5 years of the tax bill. That's called a special assessment. In this paragraph, you mark who do you expect to pay the unpaid years of the special assessment. 99% of the time, you're going to mark as the offeror for the buyer line 231, that the seller is going to pay them. I've only had 2 or 3 instances where the buyer wanted to pay it. They wanted the house so badly they were willing to pay the rest of the special assessment. Be careful, line 232, and all capitals bold says if neither box is marked, then the buyer is going to pay them. So pay special attention to that. Paragraph 10 talks about a default. Another word for default is breach of the contract. And so it says in there, and if the buyer defaults, beginning with 237, the seller's only remedy is to keep the binder deposit. That's why you have to have a good binder deposit. The seller can't sue for damages, can't sue to make the buyer buy. So we're encouraging you as listing agents to insist on good binders. And if the seller defaults, then the buyer could seek specific performance or actually go for damages. And then we remind everybody in 246 that any deposit retained by the seller is what we call liquidated damages. That means agreed damages are dispersed per the listing agreement. And the listing agreement says the listing agent gets half, so long as that half doesn't exceed their normal full commission. I think our contract is unique, beginning in paragraph 11, line 248, and having a paragraph that talks about, well, what if there's no default, but it doesn't close, nobody breached, but there were some closing costs incurred, who ought to pay for them? So I encourage you to read these two, A and B, word for word. I'll summarize. If it doesn't close because the buyer didn't get their loan, then the buyer has to reimburse the seller for costs that they've incurred, which would really only be a survey map and a title search. And if it didn't close because the seller can't deliver clear title, the seller has to reimburse buyer for the cost, which would really be the credit report and the appraisal. In all instances, the buyer pays for their inspections. We have said that over and over, beginning in line 256. Always, the buyer will pay for their home and WDO inspections. Please note line 263 and 264, however. If the reason the buyer didn't get the loan is because it didn't appraise, then each party pays their own cost. Nobody has to reimburse anybody. The Forms Committee felt that both buyer and seller agreed that the purchase price was the value or worth of the property when they made the offer and accepted the offer. So nobody's more at fault than the other that it didn't appraise. Paragraph 12 is one that I'll just summarize without reading many of the lines. It says that if there's a binder dispute and the broker's holding the binder, the broker can ask FREC for an escrow disbursement order. And by the way, FREC is proud that they're issuing the escrow disbursement orders in a very timely manner. Or the broker can have their lawyer do an interpleader where the money is taken to the court and the broker says, we don't want the money, judge, make the buyer and seller battle it out before you. And by the way, judge, reimbursed us for our court costs and attorney's fees. In that case, the broker's entitled to them. If you have a very small binder, like $1,000 or $2,000, you can often get the parties to settle by saying, hey, if we interplead, we're going to burn up almost all of that in court costs and attorney's fees. Now, subparagraph B, beginning with 274, is a different story. After closing, if there's going to be any litigation between buyer and seller, we say it's non-jury trial and each party pays their own attorney's fees. This has certainly acted to hold down litigation in Northeast Florida. We're ready to begin now the top of page 6. We're now at the top of page 6 of the NEFAR Recommended Purchase and Sale Agreement. The famous Florida case of Johnson versus Davis requires the sellers of a residential property to disclose to buyers any material adverse defects that are not readily observable. We can call those latent defects. Well, when the buyer makes the offer in line 284, they're probably going to leave that blank. But if they get anything back when the seller signs it and the seller says something's not right, then that's a counter offer to the buyer. Similarly, in 288 and 289, it says if there are any code enforcement liens, you're not going to know that, so you're going to leave that blank as the offeror, and if it comes back with any, then it's a counter offer. Going back to the Johnson versus Davis, it would be okay to put in there see seller's disclosure, and the seller can then confess all the bad things in the seller's disclosure. But it's an important Florida law. Sellers have to disclose material adverse defects that are not readily observable. When we teach core law, we spend a lot of time on that. Right, we've got some relatively new verbiage starting around 295. We're new as of August of 2015. We want the seller to represent here that they don't know of any uncorrected building or safety code violations, and they don't know of any repairs or improvements done without the proper permitting. So this would be the place for sellers to confess that they enclosed the carport without a permit, and we want that we want to know that before closing so the seller can go ask for forgiveness and get it permitted after the fact. These next disclosures, beginning at 299 down through 323, are a series of miscellaneous disclosures, some required by law and some not. 299A, energy efficiency, is required by Florida law to tell buyers they can get an energy efficiency rating. The radon gas one, beginning at 303, is required by Florida law. Luckily, we don't have hardly any or maybe no elevated radon gas levels in our area. The flood zone is something we put in. I think we were the first contract many years ago to try to open the buyer's eyes to say, check to see if there's flood insurance. We don't want you to flood insurance required. We don't want you to be surprised at the last minute. CDD, similarly, we just say, hey, we have a separate document we can hand you to explain what a CDD is. Same with mold. We just opening your eyes saying you might want to check for mold. And same for defective drywall. We're lucky that no defective drywall was imported through the Jacksonville port, and we're not aware of but one house in our area that was built entirely with the defective drywall. Airport notice zones, there's a city ordinance in Jacksonville only, in the city limits, that requires certain disclosure forms that the city makes available, not NEFAR, if the property is close to an airport. It warns about noise, and you can't light your tennis courts if it's near a runway, and crash zones. I'm going to give you the name and phone number of the go-to guy at the city about this if you think the property is near an airport, any airport, a large or small. Andy Hetzel, Hetzel, 255-7821. Right, 14 begins the important discussion of inspections and condition of property. I want you to read carefully lines 324 through 332. This says that the seller has to maintain the property in its present condition, except normal wear and tear. That means if lightning strikes the compressor between contract and closing, the seller's got to fix it. And then in all capital letters, all bold in line 330, we say it's an as-is contract. So this is an as-is contract, similar to FAR bar, it's as-is, with buyer's right to inspect. And we'll start to talk about the right to inspect on the next page. The last part of this page says, seller, you have to make utilities available, you have to make the property available for inspection, and if they're not, then the inspection time is extended by the time it's not available.